and I focus on sustainable food supply chains in particular. My PhD is focused on something that we call the short food supply chains, which is something that we will discuss today, but Communigrow is an example of that. It's something that is different from these global food supply chains that we are familiar with, those that get to the supermarkets, start in the farm and get to the supermarket, and that's how we get our food. So the alternative is the short food supply chains, which are shorter, and we will discuss that in a few more slides. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me. I hope you like this presentation, and if you have any questions, you can stop me and I can answer them as we progress. So first of all, what is the food supply chain? You might be wondering, and I'm sure you have an idea of what it is. But basically what we mean when we talk about food supply chains is that series of processes and activities that different actors carry out to take our food from the farm to the table. So it will vary depending on the produce or the product that we're talking about. But if we take as an example coffee, you can see that there are different activities that the farmers and the processors and the distributors have to do, from growing the coffee bean to picking the coffee bean, then processing that by drying the product, and then milling, and then roasting, and then grinding, and so on. So that's more or less what the supply chain looks like for coffee. And as you can see, it's a very long supply chain. So usually if we are consuming coffee here in the UK, coffee beans are not grown anywhere near where we are. So as you can imagine, it is grown near the equator in Latin America, for instance, Africa as well, and some parts of Asia, South Asia. And then those coffee beans have to travel a very long way to get to us. So these long supply chains or conventional supply chains are very long. They involve lots of different stages, lots of different activities, and lots of people. And sometimes, you know, this would travel through different countries, and it travels lots of food miles and so on. So that's more or less how the food supply chains that give us our food look like nowadays. And in that, they have become very large and larger, very long in the last 2 decades. It didn't used to be like that. We used to be, we used to live more seasonally, and that's changing now with globalization and so on. And it's the case in the UK. If you look at the statistics, you will see that the long supply chains are the ones that are feeding us. This is statistics that I got from u.gov, I think. I don't see the source, but it was supposed to be here. 1 second, just to give you, if you want to have a look at it. Yes, so it's YouGov. So they basically carry out these surveys in the UK about anything that you want to know about. So this particular question was asked to the general public in the UK, and they said that they usually get their food from in-store at supermarkets. And as you can see, there's a little bit of a trend going down from 2019 to 2021, and that's basically the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Whereas people used to go more to the supermarket, to in-store supermarkets, they are now buying more online from a supermarket, still from a supermarket, but buying online because of the COVID pandemic. And then some people buy, you know, from online, from specialist shops, you know, corner shops, organic shops, vegetable grocers, and so on. And that's it. So most of the people here in the UK get their food from a supermarket, whereas it is in a store or online. But that's where our food is coming from. That's basically around 70%, no more, 80% of people are buying food from the supermarkets, which obviously have very long food supply chains. Now, long food supply chains are good in some sense because they are feeding us. They are reducing food insecurity, for instance, in the UK and around the world. But there are some things that are wrong with it. One of them is the profit margin that, for instance, producers are getting. So it is known that working in agriculture is closely related to poverty and extreme poverty, according to the World Bank, and that's in every region of the world. I mean, whether it is developed country or developing country, it is the same case. And as an example, I can give you this cocoa example. So you can see that in terms of the profit margin that producers or the farmers are getting, it's only 6.6%, whereas retailers are getting 44% of the profit and manufacturers are getting 35% of the profit. So it's not a very balanced division, right? So that's one of the problems with long food supply chains. There are initiatives to fight these. One of those examples is fair trade, for instance, but there are other problems. Another one is the one that has to do with the carbon footprint of our very long food supply chains. And as an example, here I have this data from the UK. So transporting food within and around the UK produces 19 million tons of CO2 annually. That's the equivalent of 5.5 million typical cars driving every year. So, and this graphic shows you, the amount of greenhouse gases that agriculture, particularly intensive agriculture, is contributing to the global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a very large carbon footprint that is coming out from these long food supply chains. The other problem is soil erosion, because obviously agriculture and long food supply chains are usually associated with very intensive production systems. So we're not talking about the small producers, doing organic production and so on. No, we're talking about very intensive and damaging practices. And those are obviously degrading our soils. And as you can see, 33% of the Earth's soils are already degraded, and over 90% could become degraded by 2050. Yeah, there's a zero missing, but that's 2050. That's only 30 years, right? So 90% of our soils will be degraded if we continue like we are doing it right now. So that's the equivalent of one soccer pitch of soil, which is eroded every 5 seconds. And then soil erosion can lead to up to 50% loss in crop yields in the next few years. And that obviously has implications when it comes to food security and feeding the world. So this soil erosion is caused mainly by intensive agriculture, deforestation, and overgrazing. Then, knowing these problems with the long food supply chains, there are people that have started to worry about these issues, and they have said, okay, so which is the alternative? We know that we need long food supply chains right now, because we grew accustomed to them, and we need our food, and it's coming through there mainly. So what can we do to reduce the pressure of the food system, out of the food system, put a little bit less pressure in the food system? So they came up with this alternative. Some people have started to think about shortening the supply chain, shortening the food supply chains. And that happens in many ways. One of those, the main way in which we can shorten the supply chain is by reducing the physical distance between the farmer and the final consumers. So bringing, just growing the food locally. That's basically what some of the short food supply chains are trying to do. The other one is reducing the number of steps that connect the farmer to the final consumer. And that's mainly in terms of reducing the intermediaries between the farmer and the consumer. And then there is also another way. They call it the increase of cultural and social proximity between farmers and consumers. And one example of this obviously is Communigrow and many other initiatives that have been working on bringing people back to the land and showing them how food is grown and all the activities that go into that, and all the effort that goes into growing our food. So that's more or less what the short food supply chain is about. And there are many ways. I mean, in reality, there are many types of short food supply chains. Not all of them can be categorized, but we, in academia, we try to categorize everything and we try to simplify everything. So someone came up with this framework, which is, I suppose, handy to some extent. So they say that basically there are 4 different types of short food supply chains, although I would say that there are more than that. One of them, for instance, is the ones that they call producers as consumers. So that's basically where we as consumers are also producing the food that we are eating. And one example of that is the allotments here in the UK, community gardens, and any other types of urban agriculture. Then there is what they call the producer-consumer partnership. And one example of that is the community-supported agriculture, where we as consumers partner with the producers and we share some of the risks of growing food. Then there is the direct sale initiatives, and there the commitment that is required from the consumer is a little bit lower. And one example of that is the farmers market, where I just, as consumer, I go to the farmers market, buy my food, and I leave. But my commitment doesn't go beyond that. And there are also, for instance, box schemes and other farm shops, for instance, other types of initiatives that are only just about direct selling. There are also specialist retailers, wholesalers, online grocers, and so on. So basically, these short food supply chains, they come in all shapes and sizes. They can be collective, such as community support agriculture, CSAs, but they can also be individual. It can be just a farmer, setting up a farm shop, trying to sell directly to the consumer. And they can be community driven, like Communigrow, or they can be produced, managed, and driven. And they will vary also depending on the type of commitment that is required from the participants, whether it is producers or consumers. For instance, consumer co-ops, they require a lot of commitment from consumers, whereas farm shops do not. It's just, a direct sale initiative, and that's it. I just go, buy my food, and I leave. So now that we have a better understanding of the short food supply chains, so which are the benefits of these short food supply chains? Because at the end of the day, the aim is to achieve a more sustainable food supply chain and a more sustainable food system. So there has been lots of research about this phenomena of the short food supply chains in recent decades. I think we started around in 2000. And there have been lots of research about whether these short food supply chains actually deliver sustainability, whether they are more sustainable than long food supply chains. And that was basically the motivation that I had when I started my PhD, when I started to look at short food supply chains, because my grandfather, he is a small farmer in Mexico, and I know all the struggles that he had faced in the last few decades. So I said, maybe there is another way. Obviously, he's a small farmer. He doesn't have many opportunities. He just waits for the intermediary to come and collect whatever he produces every year, and that's it. So he doesn't have any power in the relationship, and not many options, to be honest. So I said, maybe short food supply chains are the way to go. No, maybe if he joins one of these short food supply chains, I don't know whether it is a farmers market, a CSA, maybe there would be more opportunities for him. And that's what motivated me to do this research. So basically, there are some benefits, but there are also problems when it comes to short food supply chains. In terms of the producer, the expected benefits for them is, first of all, the profit margins that increase. Then there is opportunity for value added increase, because many of them, I don't know if you have been to a farmer's market. If you go to a farmer's market, you will see that many of them sell fresh produce, but they also process some of that product, and they sell it in the form of jams, sauces, and so on. So there is an opportunity for them to do some value added. There is easier market access, especially for small producers, because if you're a small producer, if you cannot so easily sell your 10 tons of tomato to Walmart or to Tesco here in the UK. So you need the economies of scales, and that's not really easy to achieve. So these short food supply chains are an easier market for them. There is also better communication and information to consumers, because these short food supply chains, they create these spaces where they, as producers, can speak to us. They can give us information. They can communicate with us. They can receive, for instance, feedback. if they are selling, I don't know, tomatoes, they can ask us directly, do you like the produce? What do you think about the quality? What do you think about the price? And so on. These relationships within short food supply chains tend to be also more stable, commercially stable, when you compare them to, for instance, them as a small producers selling to Tesco, and not knowing whether and when they will receive, payment. There is opportunity to develop cooperation with other farmers as well. For instance, if we think about a farmers market, obviously this space creates a lot of knowledge exchange between the farmers. They can share their practices, they can improve their practices by sharing their knowledge, especially if we're talking about people that practice organic production or agroecological production. And then there is the opportunity to develop cooperation with consumers. These interactions over time tend to become something more than just a relational transaction. They become friends, trust is improved, there is more cooperation, there is more commitment. So these consumers, and that they will be there every week, for instance, in the market day, buying from you. There are also potential problems for producers, and this is something that many of the people that I spoke to about these problems related to short food supply chains in Mexico, they spoke about this. So for instance, the first one is these new functions that they have to perform, and they obviously are related to an increase in costs. So you can think about, for instance, a farmer, my grandfather, he produces mango, particularly mango, and also sometimes maize. So what he used to do was just produce the mangoes, and then wait for the intermediary to come and collect the produce, and that's it. So he got his payment, and that's all. So if he wanted to join a farmer's market, for instance, he will have to carry out new functions, for instance, marketing. So he has to learn how to clean his mangoes, his produce, and then how to move it, how to transport it to the farmer's market, and how to present it, and how to speak to people that are coming to the farmer's market to buy that food. So it generates, it creates the need for them to develop these new competencies and skills that are also listed here. And also that creates, related costs. So in terms, if we think about, for instance, transportation, that's something that they have to cover now, whereas before that was something that the intermediary will handle. So there is also this increase in workforce, depending on, again, on the short food supply chain that we are talking about. If we're talking about a CSA, that might, for instance, imply that these producers need to hire some people to work in the fields with them, because they have to increase the production and so on. So there is need for investments in equipment for processing, transportation, and selling. And again, that's also related to the new functions that they have to carry out. There is this need for diversification of production. Usually these are small farmers that transition from long supply chains to short food supply chains. They are people that used to use, for instance, intensive agriculture and have, a monocrop field. Whereas when they switch to a short food supply chain, they tend to adopt more agroecological production systems and practices, and they have to diversify, because it's not just, if I go to the farmer's market and I offer my mangoes, it's really not attractive to the consumers. So they have to diversify the pool of products that they are offering. There also opportunities restricted to areas close to the city, because that's where we tend to see farmers markets with farm shops and so on. And then there is increasing competition in short food supply chain market segment. As we see a proliferation of these initiatives, obviously there will be more competition between them. And there are also expected benefits and potential problems for consumers. The benefits first are that some of the short food supply chains tend to offer more affordable prices for the food that they offer. The other one is, I think the clearest one, which is easier access to quality products, in terms of the freshness, whether they are local, authentic, organic food. And I think that's one of the main motivations for people to buy from these short food supply chains. Then you have products that can be traceable from a known producer. You can reconnect food to the farming or to the to the activity of farming and processing, it's easier to access healthier food options. You can pursue social and ethical objectives. For instance, if you're a person that is very interested in achieving a more sustainable way of producing food, you're very worried about all the plastic in the supermarkets and all the pesticides and fertilizers and so on, you might find an alternative for you if you buy from short food supply chains. Also, obviously, the opportunity to support the local economy, because usually that money that you're putting into a short food supply chain will stay in the local community. There are problems as well. One of them is that with all this lifestyle that we have now, you need more time for food purchase. It's not the same to just go online and buy from Sainsbury's, put your order there, and then they even deliver it to you whenever you want it. It's not the same as going to the farmer's market every week, every Saturday, for instance, taking the time to visit all the stalls, buying from different people, and so on. There is also this new function to be performed in purchase and preparing food, particularly preparing food, I will say, because from supermarkets you can get lots of ready to eat meals, and that's not really so common in short food supply chains. So you basically have to learn new competences for you to be able to prepare your own food. And then there is also scarce information on where to buy this food, on where to find short food supply chains. And we also have the problem that is usually very spoken about, which is that most people that go to short food supply chains, farmers markets, for instance, are those people that are affluent and well-educated people. It's one of the issues that we have now, that they tend to be niche markets. So, and that's something that obviously has to change. Now, in general, how are short food supply chains more sustainable? One of the ways that I can see is they deliver more fairness and trust between producers and consumers. They reduce the economic uncertainty for producers, because they can bypass middlemen, they can create new jobs, they have access to better prices and so on. And in terms of environmental sustainability, obviously they adopt less polluting methods of production, usually agroecology or organic production, and obviously the reduction of food miles and food packaging. So there are many ways in which short food supply chains deliver these sustainability outcomes. But again, it will depend on the type of short food supply chain that we're talking about. And just to finish the presentation, just a question for us to reflect on. And it's a question that I also get asked a lot, and that's whether the future of food is local. And usually I say, I don't think so. I think the future of food is a hybrid system that will combine, these local food supply chains with the global supply chains that we obviously rely on. And I think it will become more balanced. But I think the opportunity here is the education role that these short food supply chains can play, such as Communigrow. I think that's the main issue now. We have to educate consumers. They have to know all the issues that are linked to global food supply chains, because I think that's a problem. Many people do not know about all these issues about the unfairness towards small farmers and profit margins and soil erosion and so on. So this role of educating people, I think, is very important, and I really congratulate you. I hope you keep doing it, because we really need it. If we want to achieve a more sustainable food system, that's the only way. I think educating people, teaching them how to grow their food, that will take some of the pressure from the food system, and obviously it will give us as consumers more resilience when it comes to facing disruptions. If you have some of the food in your house, for instance, growing courgettes, for instance, that will help you to some extent.